Okay, hello, WEL alumni. Welcome to the WEL virtual event book club featuring Carol Anne Hilton, who is the author of Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, which explores a new model of development, one that advances Indigenous self-determination, collective well-being, and reconciliation. Carol Anne is a multi-award-winning business leader with an extensive background in community, social, and economic development. She is committed to increasing the visibility and inclusion of Indigenous businesses and economic growth globally. You can grab a copy of Indigenomics and learn more about Carol Ann's work at carolannhilton.com. Carol Anne will be leading a session for us today, so I will pass it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and the invitation to come and speak with you today. As much as I'd love to be in person, the practicalities of being able to present online are fine. I'm calling in today from what is called Lekwungen territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt Indigenous people in Victoria, BC in Canada. Pleasure to join you today. As was mentioned, I'm the founder of the Indigenomics Institute and the Global Center of Indigenomics and the author of the acclaimed book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. So I wanted to spend time today bringing some focus to this concept of Indigenomics and its formation in terms of the advancement of Indigenous entrepreneurship, and to really be able to identify Indigenous economies and Indigenous business systems from a place of strength and empowerment. First, Indigenomics is essentially started as a hashtag on social media, and it was a way to begin to demonstrate a lengthy spread of stories of Indigenous business success and challenges. In that, the formation of the hashtag essentially allowed a broader perspective of emerging trends, the challenges, and places of economic power that Indigenous peoples are building both nationally and globally. I describe Indigenomics as economics from an Indigenous worldview. It is important to understand that largely economics has come from a singular worldview, and that to be able to understand its implications and its application within the natural world, that is essentially what Indigenomics is bringing. I describe Indigenomics as modern, constructive, generative Indigenous economic design. The concept of Indigenous peoples taking a place at the economic table is an important concept, largely because in the historical development of North America, essentially Indigenous peoples were disinvited to the economic table. The realization of the impacts of this, the essential relationships and the perspectives of the ability to facilitate successful business models are all still directly impacted today. In returning to this concept of modern, constructive, generative, Indigenous economic design, the concept isn't about economic growth in its entirety as what we would experience from a mainstream worldview. It brings into focus that Indigenous peoples cannot be viewed entirely from the past. To look at our modern relationship, to have constructive business models that are generating and not generating entirely for the purpose of growth, but generating business success that is directly connected to the continuation of culture, identity, language, and care for land. The ability to do this is essentially facilitated within Indigenous economic design. The concept of Indigenomics is essentially bringing into focus this concept of emerging Indigenous economic strength, that there is an ongoing increase in Indigenous economic activity that must be paid attention to, and a significant identification by Startup Canada to realize the actual rate of the increase of Indigenous business activity. Here in this, because Indigenomics essentially was built through the establishment of media stories, I utilized media stories throughout this presentation to demonstrate the headlines that are essentially bringing Indigenous business into focus. While we see a significant increase of Indigenous restaurants, Indigenous culinary and tourism experiences, we also see innovation spaces such as Agritech North, an indoor farm growing produce for customers in the Northwest Ontario, that essentially won the Bears Lair TV show as an innovation. And at the time of low supply chain issues across Ontario, this company, which is entirely Indigenous owned, was essentially feeding the region with fresh vegetables that were otherwise unavailable and coming from Arizona instead of California. The realization of the space for Indigenous business models is essential to begin to understand how they're providing and innovating, how they're building success and addressing either problems or challenges directly related to community. It is in this space that the establishment of Indigenous entrepreneurship must be understood. The rapid increase of Indigenous businesses can be likened to a cultural and business resurgence. Here in Canada, it has been identified that Indigenous entrepreneurs are the fastest growing demographic of entrepreneurs in Canada. According to national statistics, between 2001 and 2006, the number of Indigenous entrepreneurs grew by 38%. And today, as represented, Indigenous businesses are growing at 5 times the national rate. This concept of cultural and business resurgence is important because to see Indigenous peoples as facilitating successful business models, doing that within their own worldview, doing that within intentions that are directly connected to culture, to language, or continuation of Indigenous ways of being, make the distinctions of Indigenous businesses themselves. In my work of Indigenomics, I essentially talk about design, that the absence of design essentially perpetuates the status quo. To understand and build from the place, what are we designing for? It becomes important to bring that question into focus. While many of our Indigenous communities have experienced economic isolation for generations, to understand the experience of poverty as separate than income specifically, the following establishes several design principles. The first design principle of Indigenomics: poverty is not only about the lack of money. It is not having the capability to realize one's full potential as a human being. This work was built by Amartya Sen, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who brought into focus human capacity as an answer to poverty itself. I think that concept of humans' full potential and how that's expressed within business and entrepreneurship is something that needs to be paid attention to. The second design principle: poverty is the result of the systemic deprivation of opportunity. That concept of the system establishing the conditions to deprive or isolate from opportunity is something that needs to be brought to the forefront. Indigenous entrepreneurship is essentially a response to that experience of systemic deprivation of opportunity over our lifetime and over generations. The third design principle: economic growth without investment in human development is unsustainable and unethical. This concept of essentially the humanity must be invested in to bring into focus this concept of unsustainable and unethical essentially provides a polar opposite experience of how we would see economy and corporate business. And finally, we see this design principle 4, measuring what matters to well-being. To establish and design impact and criteria for impact from an Indigenous worldview, Indigenous business essentially brings and highlights this into focus, that well-being must be at the center of a powerful why, the why we do business and the impacts that we're creating. I love this concept by Malcolm X. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. This in itself forms the structure of land-based economies. When we look to groups such as through the Great Bear Rainforest, the coastal First Nations as a structure and as an established fund, the ecological Indigenous-led economy essentially has the capability of bringing employment, entrepreneurship, and career options that were previously unavailable. When we look to this example of the Great Bear Rainforest through the specific establishment of a coastal fund, focusing on guardianship or stewardship, ecotourism, and sustainable energy projects, that fund alone created over 1,200 jobs and 120 businesses since 2008. This concept of land-based economies is important to be able to pay attention to, as many Indigenous peoples pay respect to the resources that are utilized within a business model, or essentially uplifting harvesting practices and the ability to see resources and the relationship to the land as fundamental within the business model itself. This is a clear distinction of Indigenous business in the ability to really bring this concept of land-based businesses. On this slide, I establish the winning space of Indigenous-led ventures. In the middle, we see Nickmit Wine Cellars, which is currently the #2 winery in the BC region. As Indigenous-led, the connection and teachings to the land are brought forward both within the label and within the experience of the overall winery. On the left, we see Wabanaki, an Indigenous maple syrup company, who is innovating products in the market by combining key ingredients and establishing a much sought after product. And finally, on the right, we see Indigenous World, an award-winning winery also based in the Okanagan, where we're seeing not just market share, but market visualization and the experience of Indigenous wines as the new entrepreneurial space that Indigenous peoples are taking up and bringing to the economic table. The concept of Indigenous worldviews in business is important to understand and pay attention to. Indigenous businesses are intended to be able to tell stories that inspire a better future. Indigenous businesses are essentially about amplifying narratives that inspire new ways of doing business where we all grow and benefit. The community aspect of business is essential and it's potentially aligned to existing values, cultural beliefs, and ways of being on the land. Adopting business practices that are sustainable. Here in Canada, we have a company, an Indigenous company called Cheekbone Beauty, that is essentially becoming rapidly a global leader in sustainable makeup, and as an Indigenous owned company, creating spaces in major department stores as well as Sephora, the realization that the product demand for sustainable values-based makeup and the leadership of Indigenous perspective is changing the game. This concept of sustainability, to be able to see this as a place where Indigenous businesses can lead, is an important perspective and outcome of an Indigenous worldview. Next, we see that teaching business practices that demonstrate care for the land, water, and animals. To see how this is upheld within a business model is important to be able to reflect this within an Indigenous worldview or a business structure. This is essentially about shifting systems that create harm. This concept of stewardship and aligning that with sustainability practices. This is, in essence, what Indigenous businesses are able to do in the place to be able to innovate from. It's about embracing ideas that promote greater self-determination and economic inclusion. To understand these as fundamental components of the ability to facilitate what an Indigenous worldview means and how that's expressed within business. Again, it's important to relay the human side of business itself, that many Indigenous businesses are creating healing pathways and the place to grow as individuals, as families, and as communities. That we must center our personal well-being and acknowledge the courage it takes to walk in power. This is a message of entrepreneurship that essentially to build the supports, to build the powerful why, and to place our humanity at the center of the business model, I think in itself is a distinct pivot away from the scaling and pace of what we see within a Western business. That we must seek alignment in life and business. And finally, to focus our energy on solutions that hold purpose and meaning for community. When we look at these aspects of an Indigenous worldview of entrepreneurship, to bring well-being, alignment of life, innovation that's based on stewardship, and the ability to look at solutions that are driven to support community, it is in this distinction that Indigenous worldview is activated within Indigenous entrepreneurship. This idea to be gentle with one another, to strive for excellence while uplifting with dignity, kindness, and respect, to stay rooted in who we are, and to honor the lived experiences, gifts, and teachings that we carry in our work. There's a strong fundamental lands-based, community-based, and self that emerges within the concept of Indigenous businesses. That well-being, balance, sustainability, and innovation can all be housed within an Indigenous business model. I love that concept of essentially business as a tool to uphold dignity, kindness, and respect. These are aspects that are not necessarily continuously made visual or necessarily upheld within what we would see in a Western system of business. To look at this human side and to uphold those values, it's essential to begin to understand that what is unraveling is a culture of Indigenous entrepreneurship, a connected vision of Indigenous entrepreneurship. We look at the example of Entrepreneur, who describes this Indigenous entrepreneur worldview and the experience of building successful business models. Entrepreneur is a network of Indigenous Northern entrepreneurs who are innovating solutions to strengthen economic resilience and community well-being for generations to come. What a powerful depiction of the purpose of business in innovating solutions that strengthen economic resilience and community well-being across generations. This concept of across generations is also uniquely experienced within an Indigenous worldview. The responsibility of self and of community is bigger and also extends to future generations. So understanding and measuring impact, understanding and measuring sustainability, or even innovation all of those aspects become important to bring into consider within Indigenous concepts of business and entrepreneurship. The idea that there's an increasing army of Indigenous entrepreneurs, this growing realm of Indigenous-driven products, of fashion companies, of companies that are building and responding to local and regional economies. We have an army of Indigenous fashion, whether it's clothing lines or products that are facilitated into larger corporate chains. These Indigenous brands are essentially shaping and innovating the perspective of Indigenous products and supply chain. The realization of Indigenous business success is also facilitated within increasing international Indigenous trade mechanisms. It's only within minimum the past 5 years that the role of international Indigenous trade has actually started to be upheld within cross-national trade agreements. It is in this space of the role for Indigenous entrepreneurship, whether it's product development or product lines, to essentially realize Indigenous peoples are facilitating space for themselves within the regional or national supply chain. This concept of international Indigenous trade is an important mechanism for Indigenous business success and growth. This essentially establishes a space for impact. Let's begin to look at some of the places of leadership of Indigenous impact. We have Raven Indigenous Impact Fund, which just within this past week established its Fund 2 and the final closing of $100 million Indigenous focused entrepreneur fund. The realization of the business success that this company has created has essentially looked at 8 times the return on investment from the original investments or seed money that were put into the advancement of the businesses in their portfolio. To realize and bring into focus Indigenous-led structures that are measuring Indigenous impact from an Indigenous perspective again, is an important way to facilitate how is impact being described and for who. The concept of Indigenous impact, again, as I referred to earlier, this concept of design and how we design our Indigenous relationships in business. As mentioned previously, I uphold the work of Entrepreneur, which is investing into the capacity and empowering Indigenous entrepreneurs to build sustainable businesses and livelihoods. The realization that essentially building the capacity for Indigenous business success is feeding this concept of the innovation spirit. The innovation and entrepreneur spirit that is happening in Indigenous communities is amazing and powerful to be able to watch. Here we have the powwow pitch, which is across North America and is essentially calling all Indigenous entrepreneurs, artists, vendors, and businesses. An annual pitch and a series of regional pitches, the end winner can essentially have the supports, the capacities, and facilitate input into their own Indigenous business success. The uptake of powwow pitch is of significance to watch as we see companies such as Shopify or Facebook or MasterCard all beginning to invest and to realize the dreams of Indigenous entrepreneurs. To essentially see the unfoldment of powwow pitch as a movement of Indigenous entrepreneurs, that the uptake of the pace and scale of Indigenous businesses must be paid attention to. This idea of powwow pitch and bringing the visibility of small Indigenous businesses is something that Bears Lair TV is also beginning to build. After a successful first season, Bears Lair Television is an exciting new reality series on Aboriginal Peoples Television Network that was essentially a reality show that feeds on the spirit of Indigenous business across the nation. This concept of taking a hold of the narrative of Indigenous business to bring into its distinction and uphold sustainability is what the Bears Lair TV has set out to do. Featuring over 25 Indigenous entrepreneurs with differing business models and approaches, the ability to understand that the concept of an Indigenous worldview is brought into focus in the Bears Lair TV show. That the narrative of Indigenous business, that its underlying foundation, and that its outcome of sustainability, there is much to be learned from Indigenous business. Secondary to the Bears Lair TV show is the Youth Dream Entrepreneurship Camps. These camps essentially, as sponsors come on board for the TV show, also in themselves have the ability to facilitate youth seeing themselves in their own future. Have 10-year-olds that are building business models, that are looking at marketing plans and conceptualizing a business is life-changing and life-affirming, where so many young people do not see a future for themselves until business reflects an opportunity and a place to be able to learn and build from. The concept of the Bears Lair Youth Entrepreneurship Dream Camps is essentially about providing the space for youth in their own future. How empowering it is for an entire generation of young people to see business as an opportunity and as a way to change their story. And finally, a SAGE initiative. This is put together as a young Indigenous women's impact investing collective, where it's essentially bringing Indigenous women into the driver's seat and providing the skills and pathways to become impact investors that honor Indigenous concepts of commerce. The vision here is to build and enable a national ecosystem of Indigenous women impact investors who make investment capital available to Indigenous social purpose business and entrepreneurs. In the words of Sage Lacerte, equipping Indigenous women with decolonized impact investment literacy and capital, resulting in a truly circular Indigenous economy. Again, groups like SAGE Initiative or Entrepreneur are essentially facilitating the space for Indigenous peoples to create and to be able to take a seat at the economic table. It's in these leadership places that essentially are allowing the leadership space for innovation and the ability to bring new innovations and new perspectives to address the challenges of community and to address the challenges of economic isolation and exclusion over time. The concepts of impact and the concepts of design are intertwined. While here we see an explosion of Indigenous businesses, there are so many numerous examples of Indigenous businesses excelling and becoming first in their space. Here we see Salmon and Bannock, which is a globally renowned Indigenous restaurant, opening at the YVR, a world-class airport in Vancouver. The interrelationship between being on Indigenous territory, being the first Indigenous restaurant, looking at examples of the first Indigenous airline, all of these examples begin to demonstrate the potential of how Indigenous businesses is both changing lives, making impact, changing the stories, and building that space for Indigenous peoples that have been so long excluded from the economic table. Indigenomics in itself is essentially about upholding the story of our time. It's essentially about our ability to facilitate our modernity. The concept of modern Indigenous economic design is essentially about changing the story from what happened to us to designed by us through Indigenous business. The concept of Indigenomics is bringing into focus and beginning to measure Indigenous economic strength. To pay attention to the pattern or the trend of increased Indigenous economic activity. This is happening in so many different avenues and ways. The Indigenomics Institute facilitated a concept of the Indigenomics economic mix, which was 12 levers to support the growth and design of the Indigenous economy. These enablers or levers essentially included increase the space of Indigenous economic activity. These include areas such as clean energy, technology, entrepreneurship, capitalization, equity ownership, or procurement as some examples. It's in the place of being able to realize the inclusion of Indigenous businesses to uphold the visibility and to uphold the story of resilience. That is the space of Indigenomics, that Indigenous peoples are still here, that we can't be relegated to our past, that we're innovating on all fronts, whether it's ag tech, whether it's finance, whether it's impact investing, whatever those aspects are. Indigenous peoples all over North America are innovating and establishing Indigenous-led solutions and innovations through business and entrepreneurship. It is this that inspires me, and I realize what a beautiful, powerful time to be alive, where business in our families can essentially mean changing generational stories and essentially establishing a solid foundation for our future. The concept of Indigenomics has really inspired me to see and be able to facilitate the strength approach of Indigenous business and entrepreneurship. The leadership that I have seen in Indigenous business, the courage that it takes to stand and sustain what excellence means, to sustain what an Indigenous worldview means in business, and to facilitate that within the relationships and within a business model itself is both inspiring and the ability to see the challenges of this in our time. But the leadership space of Indigenous business is particularly important to pay attention to understand the driving motivations or values, to understanding the mission or mandate of what is facilitated within an Indigenous worldview. It is all these aspects that I bring great admiration for the strengths of what I've seen of resilience of Indigenous businesses. So many of them being first in their space, the first Indigenous restaurant, the first Indigenous airline, the first Indigenous shoe company, or the first Indigenous fashion show, whatever these aspects are, to realize the space of Indigenous inclusion, the space for Indigenous peoples realizing Indigenous reality to be reflected back to them in business is a huge undertaking and representative of the success that we are still here as Indigenous people. In my work at Indigenomics, it has always been an invitation for inclusion, an invitation to uphold the stories of resilience. The question has always been, who wants to play Indigenomics? Let's have the courage to do this together. I wanted to thank you for your time and for your ability of bringing this conversation together. Thank you again, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much, Carol Ann. We so appreciate you sharing your time and expertise and experience with us and the WEL alumni community. Um, sh- for directing, if people would like to learn more, read your book, am I correct that it's carolannhilton.com?
Yeah, and I can add that slide too if you want with the book and the website and things.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And is there anywhere else, if they're looking to hear more of your sort of like talks, presentations, is there anywhere else they can be going for more information on the subject?
I think there's a couple talks on YouTube. I can add that to the end slide if you want, as well as the link to the book and my website.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you again. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.